The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and spray paint. Jake Carter stopped his truck in the middle of the street, his eyes locking on the wreckage before him. For a moment, he sat frozen, his hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His home, a place he'd only recently returned to after years of living a life he couldn't talk about, looked like a battlefield. The word "outsider" was smeared across the garage door in red spray paint, the letters jagged and dripping as if they were bleeding. Shards of glass from his broken windows sparkled under the fading sunlight, and the porch, once sturdy and inviting, was now scorched black, charred remains of furniture scattered across the yard. The sight was a punch to the gut, but the sound, the low laughter of men from just beyond the fence, was what made Jake's blood turn cold. They were still here. Jake opened the door of his truck and stepped out slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't bother shutting the door. His gaze swept over the destruction, every detail registering like data on a mission. The scorched edges of his welcome mat, the half-empty beer cans littering the yard, the taunting symbols spray-painted on the siding. His home wasn't just vandalized, it was defiled. "Nice place you've got here." The voice was casual, mocking. Jake turned to see a group of men lounging near his fence, their smirks as sharp as the jagged knives they had tucked in their belts. There were 6 of them, each marked with tattoos that screamed their allegiance to something ugly. The leader, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips, was leaning against the fence post, staring at Jake like he was sizing up prey. "You, the new guy?" the wiry man asked, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "This is what happens when you don't introduce yourself properly." Jake's jaw tightened, but his face remained expressionless. He took a deep breath, letting it settle in his chest as he walked toward the wreckage. He picked up a shattered picture frame from the porch steps, his parents' wedding photo, now marred by a jagged crack running through their smiling faces. He set it gently on the railing before turning to face the men. "Who's responsible for this?" His voice was calm, steady, too steady. The gang exchanged amused glances, their leader chuckling. "We all are. Consider it a welcome gift." Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't move. His posture remained relaxed, almost too relaxed. "You have about 5 seconds to leave." One of the younger men, emboldened by the group's laughter, stepped forward. "Or what, old man? You gonna call the cops? Good luck with that. They don't come around here for people like you." Jake tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. The gang saw no threat in him, just a middle-aged man with a few scars and a quiet voice. What they didn't see was the coiled spring of muscle beneath his calm demeanor, or the years of training that had taught him to dismantle threats faster than most people could blink. "You have no idea what you're doing," Jake said quietly, his gaze fixed on the wiry leader. "Oh, we know exactly what we're doing," the man shot back, pushing off the fence and taking a step closer. His cigarette hit the ground and he ground it out with his boot. "You think you can just move in here, keep your head down, and nobody will notice? This is our town. You don't belong here." The rest of the gang started to circle, their laughter like a pack of hyenas closing in on a wounded lion. Jake didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the leader, who seemed to mistake Jake's silence for fear. "What's the matter?" the man sneered. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just realizing you're outnumbered." Jake's lips twitched. Not a smile, but something colder, more calculated. He didn't answer. Instead, he took one deliberate step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The subtle shift in his posture was enough to give the leader pause, but he masked it with bravado, drawing a knife from his belt. "Oh, big man thinks he's going to do something," the leader said, his grin widening. "Go on then. Show us what you got." Jake's gaze flicked to the knife for half a second before returning to the man's face. "Last chance," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the rising tension. "Walk away." The leader snorted. "Make me." The words barely left his mouth before Jake moved. His hand shot out like lightning, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and before anyone could react, Jake had the leader on his knees, his arm twisted behind his back. The laughter stopped. "You wanted to see what I've got," Jake said, his voice low and controlled. "Here it is." One of the gang members lunged, but Jake was ready. He released the leader and sidestepped the attack, delivering a swift elbow to the man's ribs. The thug stumbled, gasping for air, as Jake turned to face the rest of them. "Leave," Jake commanded, his voice as cold as steel. But they didn't listen. Fueled by anger and humiliation, the remaining gang members charged all at once. It was a mistake. Jake moved like a shadow, fluid and precise. He ducked under a wild swing, grabbing the attacker's arm and twisting it into a joint lock before sending him sprawling to the ground. Another came at him with a baseball bat, but Jake caught the weapon mid-swing, yanked it free, and used it to knock the man off balance. Within moments, 3 of them were on the ground, groaning in pain. The rest stood frozen, their confidence shattered as they realized this was no ordinary man. "Enough!" the leader spat, struggling to his feet. He wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, his sunken eyes blazing with fury. "You think this is over? You think you can just take us on and walk away? We'll be back. You hear me?" Jake stepped closer, his presence towering over the man despite his calm demeanor. "If you come back," he said evenly, "I won't be so kind." The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering under Jake's unrelenting gaze. With a sharp whistle, he signaled the others to retreat. One by one, they stumbled away, leaving their pride and broken weapons behind. Jake watched them go, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. When the street finally fell silent, he turned back to his house. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a challenge. And Jake Carter wasn't the type to back down. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that amplified every sound. Jake Carter stood on his battered porch, the faint scent of burnt wood and spray paint still clinging to the air. His hands rested on the railing as he stared into the darkness, his mind replaying the events of the evening. The gang had left, but their threats lingered like a shadow over his home. He glanced down at the broken picture frame he had set aside earlier. The smiling faces of his parents stared back at him through the cracked glass. Jake exhaled slowly, the weight of memories pressing against his chest. This house wasn't just a place to retire. It was his sanctuary, a connection to a simpler time before his life became a series of classified missions and moral compromises. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter behind him, breaking the silence. Jake turned, stepping inside and picking it up. The screen lit up with the name of an old friend, Mia Torres. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Jake," Mia's voice came through, sharp and concerned. "I just saw the news. Is it true?" Jake frowned. "What news?" "There's a video going around. Someone caught part of that fight outside your house. It's already getting attention. People are talking about the guy who took down half a gang on his own. Is that you?" Jake sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't ask for attention." "Well, you've got it," Mia said. "And if I know you, this isn't just about a couple of punks vandalizing your house." "It's not," Jake admitted. He glanced at the notebook he had picked up after the gang fled, sitting on the counter next to his gear. "There's more to this. The gang isn't just a bunch of local thugs. They're part of something bigger." "How much bigger?" Mia's tone shifted, her years as an intelligence analyst kicking in. "Big enough to worry me," Jake replied. He flipped open the notebook, scanning its contents. "I found something they left behind. It's a notebook with coded entries, names, locations, and what looks like shipping schedules. I don't know what they're moving, but it's not legal." Mia paused on the other end of the line. "You need to get out of there, Jake. If this gang is connected to something larger, they'll come after you. They don't leave loose ends." Jake's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm not a loose end." "That's not the point," Mia snapped. "You're not in the field anymore. You're not backed by an agency or a team. It's just you." "Not for long," Jake said. "I was hoping you'd help me figure out what this is." Mia sighed. You really don't know how to stay out of trouble, do you? Trouble has a way of finding me, Jake said dryly. Can you take a look at this notebook? I'll send you photos. Fine, Mia relented, but you owe me. Jake hung up and began snapping photos of the notebook's pages, sending them to Mia one by one. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the dark street. A single car idled at the corner, its headlights off. The hair on the back of Jake's neck stood on end. They're already watching. Jake didn't sleep that night. Instead, he stayed by the window, his mind racing with possibilities. If the gang was part of a larger operation, they wouldn't take his interference lightly. He knew how these things worked. He had been on the other side of them. The people pulling the strings wouldn't rest until they eliminated the threat he posed. By dawn, Jake had a plan. He gathered his gear, packing a small bag with essentials, a knife, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a handgun he had kept locked in a safe under the floorboards. He didn't expect the fight to come to him again, not immediately, but he wasn't taking any chances. As he loaded the bag into his truck, his phone buzzed with a new message from Mia. Mia. The notebook is worse than I thought. The codes reference smuggling routes and something called the broker. Ever heard of it? Jake frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen as he replied. Jake. No, what else? Mia. The broker is some kind of high-level operator. They move people, weapons, drugs, whatever pays. The routes in your notebook suggest they're setting up a hub in your area. Jake. Why here? Mia. Could be the location. Could be they think it's low risk. But if they're here, they're planning something big. You need to be careful. Jake didn't respond immediately. He stared at the message, his jaw tightening. If Mia was right, his small hometown was about to become the epicenter of something far worse than petty crime. Later that day, Jake made his way into town, stopping by a small diner where he knew people would talk. The place hadn't changed much since he was a kid. Vinyl booths, the smell of coffee and grease, and a bell above the door that jingled when you walked in. He slid into a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the room. The conversation at the counter caught his attention. Did you hear about what happened on Maple Street last night? One man asked, leaning toward the waitress as she poured his coffee. Yeah, she replied, lowering her voice. They say it was the Connors gang again. Those guys have been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. Who's going to stop them? The cops? They're too scared, or too lazy. Jake sipped his coffee, listening without looking directly at them. The Connors gang. So, that's what they called themselves. He filed the name away. The bell jingled, and Jake glanced toward the door. Two men walked in, their leather jackets and tattooed knuckles marking them as trouble. They scanned the diner before their eyes landed on Jake. A smirk spread across one of their faces as they approached his booth. You're the guy, aren't you? The taller one said, leaning against the booth. The one who gave our boys a little trouble last night. Jake set his coffee down slowly, meeting the man's gaze. Depends who's asking. The shorter thug chuckled, sliding into the seat across from Jake uninvited. Name's Mitch. This here's Ray, and you, my friend, made yourself a very bad enemy. Jake didn't flinch. That so? Mitch leaned closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. You've got no idea what you're messing with. The Connors gang doesn't just let things go. Axel's not happy, and when Axel's not happy, people start disappearing. Jake's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Axel, that's your leader? Mitch frowned, realizing too late that Jake was gathering information. Doesn't matter who he is. What matters is that you've got a target on your back. Ray smirked, pulling a knife from his jacket and twirling it between his fingers. Unless, of course, you decide to pack up and leave. Could save yourself a lot of trouble. Jake leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed, though his muscles were coiled like a spring. I'm not going anywhere. The two thugs exchanged a glance before Mitch shrugged and slid out of the booth. Your funeral. As they walked out, Jake watched them through the window. Ray paused just outside, dragging his knife across the side of Jake's truck, leaving a deep scratch before sauntering away. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He had learned long ago that patience was a weapon, and his moment would come. For now, he had what he needed: a name, a leader, and confirmation that this was far from over. Jake sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the scratch on the door as the sun dipped lower in the sky. His reflection in the rearview mirror was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. If the Connors gang thought they could scare him, they were wrong. They weren't just picking a fight, they were inviting a reckoning. Jake didn't just survive conflict, he thrived in it, and by the time this was over, they would regret ever crossing him. The late-night air was cool and still as Jake Carter stood at the edge of the abandoned lumberyard. It was dark enough to conceal him, but the faint glow of floodlights in the distance told him everything he needed to know. This was where the Connors gang operated when they weren't spreading chaos in town. Jake had been here before, years ago, when it was a legitimate business. Now it was the gang's den, a place where deals were struck and threats were made. He crouched behind a stack of rusted metal drums, his eyes locked on the two men standing near the entrance. They were smoking, their voices low but careless. Jake had spent the last day piecing together what he could about the Connors gang from whispers in town. Axel, the gang's leader, wasn't just a thug, he was a gatekeeper for something bigger. His name had come up repeatedly in the notebook Jake had found, along with references to someone called the Broker. Whoever the broker was, they were financing the gang and likely pushing them to expand their reach. Jake had no intention of waiting for the gang to make their next move. They had already crossed the line by targeting his home and threatening the people in his neighborhood. Now it was his turn. Jake adjusted the strap on his small backpack, ensuring it was secure. Inside were tools of his trade, non-lethal equipment that would allow him to dismantle the gang without crossing any ethical lines. Smoke grenades, zip ties, and a compact flashlight were all neatly packed alongside his primary weapon, a tranquilizer gun he had kept from his days in the field. He wasn't looking to make the news again. He was looking to send a message. The two men at the entrance laughed loudly, their postures relaxed. Jake observed them carefully. They were young, probably in their early 20s, and overconfident, traits that could work in his favor. He silently counted to 3 before making his move. In one fluid motion, Jake stepped out of the shadows and moved toward the entrance. His boots barely made a sound against the gravel as he closed the distance. The first guard didn't even notice him until it was too late. Jake grabbed him from behind, clamping a hand over his mouth and injecting a tranquilizer into his neck. The man's body went limp within seconds, and Jake lowered him gently to the ground. The second guard turned, his eyes widening as he saw Jake. He fumbled for the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, but Jake was faster. A well-placed strike to the wrist sent the device tumbling to the ground, and before the man could shout, Jake knocked him out with a quick, precise blow to the jaw. Jake dragged the two unconscious men behind the metal drums, ensuring they were hidden from view. He then retrieved their walkie-talkies, slipping one into his pocket and tuning in to the gang's frequency. Static crackled, followed by voices. "Everything clear at the entrance?" a voice asked. Jake pressed the button to respond, mimicking the tone and cadence of the guard he'd just taken down. "Yeah, all clear." There was a pause, then a response. "Good. Axel's expecting everyone in the main building for the meeting. Don't screw it up." Jake's jaw tightened. Axel was here, and he wasn't just hiding. He was planning something. Jake slipped deeper into the lumberyard, his movements calculated and silent. The layout was familiar enough. Storage sheds, rusted machinery, and stacks of rotting lumber that created plenty of blind spots. He used them all to his advantage, avoiding the beams of flashlights carried by patrolling gang members. Jake reached one of the storage sheds, its door slightly ajar. Inside, he found what he'd been looking for: crates filled with weapons, unmarked packages, and stacks of cash. He took out his phone and snapped photos of everything: making sure to document the gang's arsenal. This wasn't just a local operation. This was a supply hub. As he scanned the room, his eyes landed on a small table covered in papers. Maps, invoices, and ledgers lay scattered, detailing shipments to other towns and payments to individuals whose names were redacted. Jake's stomach churned. This was bigger than he thought. He photographed every page, making sure to capture the incriminating details. Just as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, a noise outside caught his attention. Footsteps, heavy and unhurried. Jake moved quickly, pressing himself against the wall as the door creaked open. A burly man stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He muttered something under his breath as he scanned the room. Jake waited, his breath steady, until the man turned his back. Then, with the precision of years spent in the field, Jake moved behind him, clamping an arm around his neck and cutting off his air supply. The man struggled for a moment before slumping unconscious. Jake lowered him to the ground and stepped back into the shadows. Jake followed the sound of voices to the main building, a large, weathered structure with cracked windows and a faded sign that once read, Maplewood Lumber Co. The gang's meeting was in full swing, the muffled conversation growing clearer as Jake approached. He climbed onto a stack of crates and peered through a high window. Inside, Axel stood at the center of the room, addressing a group of about 15 men. He was animated, his arms gesturing wildly as he spoke. "This is it," Axel said, his voice carrying authority. "The broker's counting on us to secure this town. We lock it down, and we get the green light to expand. Anyone who gets in our way, well, you know what to do." The men murmured in agreement, a mix of excitement and unease in their voices. Jake's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a gang. It was a militia in the making. Jake couldn't let Axel's plan unfold. He carefully removed a smoke grenade from his bag and pulled the pin. With a calculated toss, he sent it crashing through the window. The grenade hissed as thick gray smoke filled the room, cutting off visibility and sending the gang into chaos. "What the hell?" someone shouted. Jake slipped inside through a side entrance, using the confusion to his advantage. He moved quickly, taking down one man after another with precise strikes and tranquilizers. The gang's disorganized shouts and coughing gave him cover as he worked his way toward Axel. By the time the smoke began to clear, half the gang was incapacitated, and the rest were scrambling to regroup. Axel stood in the middle of the chaos, barking orders. "Find him! Take him down!" Jake stepped out of the shadows, his tranquilizer gun raised. "Looking for me." Axel spun around, his eyes widening before narrowing in anger. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you're out of your league." Jake didn't flinch. "You've already lost. The cops are on their way, and I've got enough evidence to put you and your operation away for good." Axel smirked, reaching for a weapon tucked into his waistband. But Jake was faster. A tranquilizer dart hit Axel in the arm, and the leader staggered, his expression twisting into disbelief as he collapsed to the ground. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance as Jake stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the unconscious gang. He took one last look around, ensuring he hadn't missed anything before slipping out the back. As he disappeared into the night, his phone buzzed with a message from Mia. "Mia, the notebook's codes match a federal case. I'm sending your evidence to the right people. You just took out a major player." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he stepped into his truck, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. This wasn't over, not yet. But tonight, he'd dealt a heavy blow to the Connors gang, and the broker would soon feel the ripple effects. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as Jake drove back to his battered home, knowing this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The smell of stale coffee filled Jake's kitchen as he leaned over the counter, studying the photographs on his phone. Every image he'd taken at the gang's hideout told a larger story, one of greed, violence, and unchecked power. He swiped through pictures of crates filled with weapons, ledgers filled with coded transactions, and maps marked with routes spanning several states. At the center of it all was a name: the broker. Jake exhaled slowly, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. He wasn't surprised to find a bigger operation behind the Connors gang, but the scale of what he'd uncovered was troubling. This wasn't a small-town problem. It was national, maybe even global. And Axel, the gang's leader, was just one cog in a much larger machine. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Mia Torres, his old friend and former intelligence analyst. She'd been his lifeline since this started, helping him piece together the connections between the gang and the shadowy figure pulling the strings. "Mia," he answered, his tone clipped but calm. "I've been going through the files you sent me," she said, her voice urgent. "It's worse than we thought, Jake." "Define worse." "Those shipping routes? They're not just moving weapons. They're moving people. Trafficking, Jake. The Connors gang is running one of the pipelines for the broker. And it's not just here. They've got hubs in 3 other states. Maybe more." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He'd seen a lot in his career, but human trafficking was always the hardest to stomach. And the money. "It's flowing through offshore accounts, but I've traced some of it back to a shell corporation. It's registered to a man named Victor Kane. Ever heard of him?" Jake frowned. "No. Who is he?" "Big-time investor," Mia said. "Real estate, logistics, tech, you name it. On paper, he's a legitimate businessman. But I've seen his name pop up in black market dealings before. He's the kind of guy who pays other people to get their hands dirty." Jake nodded to himself. "So, he's the broker?" "Most likely," Mia replied, "but it's not enough to know that. We need proof. Solid, irrefutable proof. And I think I know where to find it." Mia sent Jake a location pin, a luxury high-rise building in the nearby city of Crestview. According to her, Kane operated out of the penthouse suite, running his empire from the top floor while keeping his hands clean. It was the kind of place designed to make people feel untouchable. "You sure he'll have something there?" Jake asked. "If Kane is half as arrogant as I think he is, he'll have backups," Mia said. "People like him always do, and from what I've seen, he's not expecting anyone to come knocking." Jake glanced at the map on his phone, calculating the risks. "All right, I'll head out tonight." "Be careful," Mia warned. "This guy isn't just another gang leader. He's got resources, security, and connections that go way beyond what you're used to dealing with." Jake smirked faintly. "Sounds like a challenge." The high-rise building was a stark contrast to the small-town streets Jake had called home. The sleek glass exterior shimmered under the city lights, and a doorman stood at the entrance, greeting well-dressed guests as they entered. Jake watched from across the street, his nondescript jacket and ball cap helping him blend into the shadows. Mia's voice crackled in his ear through a discreet earpiece. "Security's tight, but the service entrance in the back has minimal coverage. You'll need to time it between patrols." "Got it," Jake replied, already moving. He rounded the corner and slipped into the alley behind the building. A lone camera scanned the area, its movements predictable. Jake waited until it swiveled away before darting to the door and picking the lock with practiced efficiency. Once inside, he found himself in a dimly lit hallway lined with crates and cleaning supplies. He moved quickly but cautiously, navigating the labyrinth of service corridors until he reached the freight elevator. According to Mia, it was the easiest way to reach the penthouse without drawing attention. "Elevator's clear," Mia said, her voice steady in his ear. "You've got about 5 minutes before the next patrol." Jake pressed the button and stepped inside, his hand resting on the tranquilizer gun strapped to his hip. As the elevator ascended, he took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He'd done this 1,000 times before, but there was always an edge to missions like this, walking into the lion's den with no guarantee of walking out. The elevator doors slid open silently, revealing the opulent interior of the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and modern furnishings filled the expansive space. It was the kind of place that screamed wealth and power. Jake stepped out, his movements silent as he scanned the room. He spotted a sleek black desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and a laptop. He moved toward it, pulling out a small USB drive Mia had given him. "Plug it into the laptop," Mia instructed, It'll copy everything and send it directly to me." Jake inserted the drive and watched as the device lit up, its tiny screen displaying a progress bar. As it worked, he rifled through the papers on the desk, snapping photos of anything that looked important. There were contracts, invoices, and a list of names. Names he recognized from the Connors gang's ledger. He was halfway through photographing the documents when the sound of footsteps froze him in place. Someone was coming. Jake quickly pocketed the USB drive and slipped into the shadows, pressing himself against the wall as the footsteps grew louder. A man in a tailored suit entered the room, his face illuminated by the glow of the city lights. Jake recognized him immediately from the photos Mia had sent him. Victor Kane. Kane moved to the desk, oblivious to Jake's presence. He muttered to himself as he shuffled through the papers, his frustration evident. "Idiots can't handle anything without my help." Jake's hand tightened around the tranquilizer gun. He could take Kane down right now, but it wouldn't accomplish anything. They needed him alive, and they needed his network exposed. As Kane picked up the phone and began dialing, Jake moved silently toward the door. He couldn't risk being seen. Not yet. He slipped out of the penthouse just as the elevator doors closed behind him, his heart pounding, but his mind focused. Mia guided him back through the service corridors, her voice calm and precise. "You're clear to exit, but move fast. Security's making rounds." Jake navigated the maze-like halls with ease, slipping out the same way he'd come in. By the time he reached the alley, his pulse had steadied, and the tension in his shoulders began to ease. "Did you get everything?" Mia asked. "Everything and more," Jake replied. "But Kane was there. He's hands-on with this operation." "That's bad news for him," Mia said. "The data you pulled is already uploading. Once it's decrypted, we'll have everything we need to bring him down." Jake nodded to himself. This was far from over, but they'd taken a major step forward. As he walked toward his truck, the city lights casting long shadows around him, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. The broker thought he was untouchable, but Jake was about to prove him wrong. Back at home, Jake sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the files Mia had sent him. The names, the routes, the money, it all painted a clear picture of a vast criminal enterprise. But the fight was far from over. The broker wouldn't go down without a fight, and Jake knew this was only the beginning. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed with a new message from Mia. "Mia, the files are solid. We have enough to involve the feds. But if Kane realizes what's happening, he'll vanish. We need to act fast." Jake typed his response quickly. "Jake, let's finish this." With that, he stood, his resolve hardening. The game wasn't over yet, and Jake Carter wasn't the type to quit before the final move. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. Spread out before him were the decrypted files Mia had sent over. Names, numbers, and locations filled the screen, each one a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, painted a chilling picture of the broker's operation. Jake leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin as he stared at the map on the wall, a map now dotted with red pins marking key locations connected to the network. The broker's influence wasn't limited to Crestview. His operations spanned multiple states, with hubs in urban centers and rural areas alike. Weapons, money, and people flowed through these locations like veins pumping lifeblood into a criminal empire. At the center of it all was Victor Kane, running the show from his glass tower in Crestview, untouchable and arrogant. Jake's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered his options. This wasn't just about taking down a gang or disrupting a single smuggling route. This was about dismantling an entire system. And to do that, he needed more than evidence. He needed to make a statement. His phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. It was Mia. "You ready to talk strategy?" she asked as he answered. "I'm ready," Jake replied, his tone steady. "Tell me what we've got." Mia's voice crackled through the line, calm and focused. "The files you pulled from Kane's penthouse gave us everything we need to build a case. Payment logs, coded communications, even photos of shipments. It's all there." "But," Jake prompted, sensing hesitation, "but Kane's already moving to cover his tracks. He's pulling assets, rerouting funds, and shutting down smaller hubs. If we wait too long, he'll go underground." Jake exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "So, we hit him where it hurts before he has a chance to disappear." "Exactly," Mia said. "The files indicate there's a shipment moving through a secondary hub tonight, a warehouse on the outskirts of Crestview. It's a major transfer point. If we can intercept it, we'll not only cripple their supply chain but also flush Kane out." "And the shipment?" Jake asked. "According to the logs, it's a mix of weapons and cash," Mia replied. "But more importantly, it's carrying documents, ledgers, contracts, and account details. If we can secure those, we'll have enough to tie Kane directly to the operation." Jake nodded, already formulating a plan. "What's security like at the warehouse?" "Moderate," Mia said. "The broker doesn't keep heavy security at these transfer points to avoid drawing attention. But don't underestimate them. They'll be armed, and they won't hesitate to protect the shipment." Jake stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he grabbed his gear. "Send me the coordinates. I'll handle it." "You're not going alone," Mia said firmly. "I've got someone on the ground who can back you up." Jake paused, his brow furrowing. "Who?" An hour later, Jake pulled up to a secluded diner just outside Crestview. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a single motorcycle parked near the entrance. Jake stepped out of his truck, scanning the area before heading inside. Seated at a booth near the back was a woman in her late 30s, her dark hair pulled into a tight braid. She wore a leather jacket over a tactical vest, and her sharp eyes immediately locked onto Jake as he approached. "You must be Jake," she said, standing to shake his hand. "Mia told me you'd be hard to miss." "And you are?" Jake asked, his grip firm. "Lauren Vega," she replied. "Former Army, now freelance. Mia and I go way back." Jake nodded, assessing her. There was a quiet confidence about her, the kind that came from years of experience. "You know what we're walking into?" "Warehouse, armed guards, high-value shipment," Lauren said, ticking off the points on her fingers. "Sounds like a fun night." Jake allowed himself a faint smile. "Let's make sure it's a productive one." The warehouse was exactly as Mia had described, an unassuming structure surrounded by chain-link fencing and floodlights. Jake and Lauren crouched in the shadows, their movements deliberate as they surveyed the area. "2 guards at the front entrance," Lauren whispered, peering through her binoculars. "Another 2 patrolling the perimeter. No sign of anyone inside yet." Jake nodded, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "We take out the patrols first. Quietly." Lauren smirked. "I like quiet." The 2 moved like shadows, their training evident in every step. Jake took the first guard, slipping behind him and locking an arm around his neck. The man struggled briefly before going limp, and Jake lowered him to the ground. Lauren handled the second guard with equal efficiency, her knife flashing briefly in the moonlight before the man collapsed silently. With the perimeter clear, they regrouped near the side entrance. Lauren gestured to a keypad by the door. "Think you can handle that?" Jake pulled a small device from his pocket, connecting it to the keypad. The device beeped softly as it cycled through codes before emitting a low click. The door unlocked. "Let's move," Jake said, pushing the door open. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, rows of crates stacked high against the walls. The air smelled of oil and dust, and the faint hum of machinery filled the space. Jake and Lauren moved cautiously, their weapons drawn as they navigated the labyrinth of storage containers. "Over there," Lauren whispered, pointing to a group of men near the center of the warehouse. They were gathered around a large crate, their voices low as they worked to load its contents onto a truck. Jake motioned for Lauren to follow him, and the 2 crept closer, keeping to the shadows. From their new vantage point, they could see the crate's contents, stacks of cash bundled in plastic wrap, alongside weapons carefully packed in foam. "That's our shipment," Jake murmured. "We need to take them out before they get it on that truck." Lauren grinned. Say the word." Jake took a deep breath, then nodded. "Now." Jake and Lauren moved as one, their attack swift and precise. Lauren fired a stun round at one of the men, dropping him before he could react, while Jake disarmed another with a single, calculated strike. The remaining guards scrambled for their weapons, but they were no match for the duo's speed and skill. Within moments, the room was silent, the guards incapacitated, and the shipment untouched. "Clear," Lauren said, lowering her weapon. Jake moved to the crate, pulling out a stack of papers tucked between the cash bundles. He scanned the documents quickly, his eyes narrowing. "These are the ledgers. Everything we need to tie Kane to this operation." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "That easy?" Jake shook his head. "Not quite. Kane's going to know we were here. This is just the beginning." Jake and Lauren loaded the ledgers and other evidence into a duffel bag, their movements efficient as they prepared to leave. But as they approached the exit, the sound of approaching vehicles froze them in place. "Back up," Lauren muttered, her grip tightening on her weapon. Jake glanced around, his mind racing. "We can't fight them here. We need to move." The two slipped out a side door just as a convoy of SUVs pulled into the lot. From their vantage point, they watched as more armed men poured into the warehouse, their shouts echoing in the night. "Looks like Kane's not wasting time," Lauren said. Jake's jaw tightened. "Let him come. We've got what we need." As they disappeared into the shadows, Jake felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The broker's operation was unraveling, and the evidence they'd secured would be the final nail in its coffin. But he knew this fight was far from over. Kane wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would Jake. The engine of Jake's truck roared to life as he and Lauren sped away from the warehouse. The duffel bag containing the ledgers and incriminating documents rested between them on the seat, a silent reminder of what they'd accomplished. But Jake's mind was already on the next step. The evidence was solid, but Kane wouldn't take this lightly. He'd retaliate, and it wouldn't just be about reclaiming the documents. It would be personal. Lauren leaned back in her seat, watching the dark road stretch ahead of them. "You know they're going to come after us, right?" Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. "I'm counting on it." Lauren glanced at him, her eyebrows raised. "That's not exactly comforting." Jake smirked faintly. "Kane's not used to being cornered. He's going to lash out, make mistakes. We use that to our advantage." Lauren shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You really do have a death wish, don't you?" "Not a death wish," Jake replied. "Just a plan." The safe house was an old hunting cabin tucked deep into the woods, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't much to look at, just a single-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it was secure. Jake had chosen it for its isolation and defensibility, knowing it would give him and Lauren a place to regroup. As they unloaded the truck, Jake's phone buzzed. It was Mia. "You're alive," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I was starting to think you ran into trouble." "Not yet," Jake replied. "But Kane knows we hit the warehouse. He sent reinforcements while we were leaving." "Figures," Mia said. "The good news is, I've been digging into those files. The ledgers you grabbed tie Kane directly to the broker. Bank transfers, coded messages, it's all there." Jake set the duffel bag on the cabin's table and opened it, pulling out the documents. "Is it enough to bring them down?" "It's enough to make their lives miserable," Mia replied. "But we need more if we want to shut this down for good. Kane still has assets, and the broker's network runs deep." Jake frowned, his jaw tightening. "Then we hit them again." Mia hesitated. "Jake, you've already stirred the hornet's nest. Kane's not just going to sit back and wait for you to strike again. He's going to come after you, and anyone helping you." Jake's eyes flicked to Lauren, who was inspecting a map pinned to the wall. "Then we'll be ready." Jake and Lauren spent the next few hours fortifying the safe house. They reinforced the doors and windows, set up motion sensors around the perimeter, and prepared an escape route in case things went south. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. They both knew that Kane wouldn't stop until he recovered the evidence or silenced them permanently. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Jake sat at the table studying the ledgers again. One entry in particular caught his eye, a series of payments labeled Phoenix. The name appeared multiple times, always tied to large sums of money and vague descriptions like logistics and security. "Mia," Jake said, calling her again. "Does Phoenix mean anything to you?" There was a pause on the other end before Mia responded. "It's a code name. I've seen it before in connection to private security contracts. Mercenaries, mostly. If Kane's using them, he's not just protecting his operation. He's gearing up for a fight." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Any idea where they're operating out of?" "Give me a second," Mia said, the sound of her typing filling the line. "There's a facility near the state line. It's not marked as a Phoenix hub, but it matches the profile. Isolated, high security, minimal public records." Jake's mind raced. If Kane was using mercenaries, it meant he was preparing for more than just defense. He was planning to escalate. And if they didn't stop him soon, more people would get hurt. Lauren crossed the room, her arms folded. "You're thinking about hitting their facility, aren't you?" Jake nodded. "If we take out Phoenix, Kane loses his muscle. It's a risk, but it's worth it." Lauren tilted her head, studying him. "You realize that means going straight into the lion's den, right? These aren't street thugs. They're professionals." "That's why we need to be smarter," Jake said. "We hit fast and hard, grab what we need, and get out." Lauren sighed, leaning against the table. "I signed up for danger, but you're pushing the limits here." Jake smirked. "You scared?" "Not even a little," Lauren shot back. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it right." The Phoenix facility was located deep in a wooded area, surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter, and patrols moved in predictable patterns. Jake and Lauren observed from a ridge overlooking the facility, their gear packed and ready. "2 guards at the gate, another 3 patrolling the interior," Lauren said, scanning the area through binoculars. "There's also a control tower near the center. That's probably where they're monitoring the cameras." Jake nodded. "We take out the guards quietly, disable the cameras, and get inside. Mia said there's a central server room where they're storing their data. That's our target." Lauren grinned. "Sounds easy enough." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You've got a strange definition of easy." The first guard didn't even see them coming. Jake moved like a shadow, his tranquilizer gun hissing as a dart struck the man's neck. Lauren took out the second guard with a quick, silent takedown, her knife flashing briefly in the moonlight. They slipped through a gap in the fence and made their way toward the control tower. Lauren climbed the exterior ladder with practiced ease, disabling the cameras while Jake covered her from below. Once the lights on the tower blinked off, they moved toward the main building. The interior was quiet, the hum of servers filling the air. Jake pulled out a USB drive and plugged it into one of the terminals, watching as the data began to transfer. Come on," he muttered, glancing at the progress bar. Lauren stood by the door, her weapon ready. "Hurry up, we've got company." Jake's heart pounded as he watched the progress bar crawl toward completion. He could hear the faint sound of boots on concrete, growing louder with each passing second. "Done," he said, pulling the USB drive and slipping it into his pocket. "Let's move." They barely made it out of the building before the alarm blared. Red lights bathed the facility as guards scrambled into action, their shouts echoing through the compound. "This way," Jake called, leading Lauren toward the perimeter. They ducked behind crates and darted through shadows, avoiding patrols as they made their way back to the fence. Lauren pulled a pair of bolt cutters from her pack, slicing through the chain link as Jake covered her. The moment the gap was wide enough, they slipped through and sprinted into the woods. Bullets whizzed past them, but they didn't stop. They ran until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, their breaths ragged, but their resolve unshaken. Back at the safe house, Jake plugged the USB drive into his laptop, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. The files contained everything they needed: Phoenix's contracts, Kane's communications, and even a list of high-profile clients connected to the broker. Mia's voice crackled through the line. "You did it! This is it, Jake. This is what we needed." Jake leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. "It's not over yet. Kane's going to retaliate." Lauren placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression serious. "Then we make sure we're ready." Jake nodded, his gaze hardening. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they had the upper hand, and he wasn't about to let that go. The safe house was eerily quiet as Jake sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. The files they'd pulled from the Phoenix facility sat on the table beside him, a USB drive that could dismantle Kane's empire. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Kane would strike back. Of that, Jake was certain. He just didn't know when. Lauren sat at the table, cleaning her weapons with meticulous precision. Her movements were calm, but her eyes betrayed her tension. "You've been quiet," she said, not looking up. "What's on your mind?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He kept his gaze on the woods, scanning for any sign of movement. "Kane knows we hit his facility. He won't let that slide." Lauren nodded, slotting a fresh magazine into her sidearm. "Good, let him come. I'm tired of running." Jake glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "That's what I like about you. Always looking for a fight." "Someone has to keep things interesting," she replied, her tone light but her grip firm on her weapon. The tension in the room was broken by the faint buzz of Jake's phone. He glanced at the screen and saw Mia's name. Answering quickly, he put the phone to his ear. "What do you have?" Jake asked. "Trouble," Mia said, her voice tight. "Kane's moving fast. I intercepted some chatter. He's deploying a team to your location." Jake's jaw tightened. "How much time do we have?" "An hour, maybe less," Mia replied. "He's pulling out all the stops. This isn't just a cleanup crew. It's an assault team." Jake exchanged a glance with Lauren, who was already on her feet. "Thanks for the heads up," he said, ending the call. He turned to Lauren, his voice steady but firm. "We need to prepare." The two of them moved quickly, their years of training kicking in as they turned the cabin into a defensible position. Jake checked the motion sensors he'd placed around the perimeter, ensuring they were active and functioning. Lauren set up a small array of tripwires and flashbang traps near the tree line, designed to disorient anyone who got too close. "This place won't hold forever," Lauren said as she worked. "If they breach, we'll have to fall back." Jake nodded, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "The goal isn't to win a firefight. It's to buy time." "For what?" Lauren asked, her tone sharp. Jake pulled out the USB drive and held it up. "For Mia to send this to the feds. Once they have it, Kane's operation is finished." Lauren's expression softened slightly. "And what about us?" Jake's eyes hardened. "We make sure they don't take this place without a fight." As the final preparations were made, the two of them took a moment to catch their breath. Lauren leaned against the wall, her hands resting on her knees as she exhaled. "You ever get tired of this?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jake sat on the edge of the table checking his gear. "What? Saving the world?" "No," Lauren said with a faint smile. "Fighting battles no one else even knows about." Jake paused, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes. But someone has to do it." Lauren nodded, her gaze distant. "I used to think that, too. Then I realized the world doesn't change, no matter how hard you fight." Jake looked at her, his voice softening. "Maybe not, but sometimes you save enough people to make it worth it." The conversation was cut short by a sharp beep from the motion sensors. Jake's head snapped toward the monitor where a red dot appeared on the screen. "They're here," he said, his voice low. The first sign of the assault was the faint hum of engines in the distance. Jake and Lauren crouched by the windows, their weapons ready as the sound grew louder. Moments later, a convoy of SUVs pulled up to the edge of the woods, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "They brought friends," Lauren muttered, counting the vehicles. At least 20 men. Jake didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the scene outside, his mind racing through every contingency plan he'd ever made. The men began to pour out of the vehicles, their movements disciplined and methodical. These weren't ordinary gang members, they were mercenaries, hired guns who knew exactly what they were doing. "Wait for the first tripwire," Jake said, his voice calm. "Let them come to us." The mercenaries fanned out, moving cautiously toward the cabin. The first man tripped the wire and the explosion of a flashbang lit up the woods. Shouts erupted as the group scattered, some covering their ears while others raised their weapons in confusion. Jake took the opportunity to fire, his rifle cracking as he hit one of the mercenaries square in the chest. Lauren followed suit, her shots precise as she took down 2 more. "They're flanking," Lauren shouted, moving to cover the side window. Jake nodded, shifting his position to cover the front. The mercenaries regrouped quickly, their training evident as they advanced in coordinated waves. Jake and Lauren fired in bursts, aiming to suppress rather than kill. The cabin's walls shuddered under the impact of return fire, and the air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. One of the mercenaries tossed a smoke grenade through a broken window, filling the room with a choking haze. Jake pulled Lauren back toward the kitchen, coughing as he tried to think. "We can't hold this position," Lauren said, her voice muffled by the smoke. "We need to move." Jake nodded, grabbing the duffel bag containing the evidence. "Through the back. Go." They slipped out the back door, moving low and fast as bullets tore through the walls behind them. The woods provided some cover, but the mercenaries were relentless, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they pursued. Jake and Lauren reached a clearing, their breaths ragged as they ducked behind a fallen tree. The mercenaries were close, their voices growing louder. "This is it," Lauren said, checking her ammo. "No more running." Jake's jaw tightened. "We make our stand here." The first mercenary stepped into the clearing, his weapon raised. Jake fired, dropping him instantly. More followed, and the air filled with the deafening crack of gunfire. Jake and Lauren moved like a well-oiled machine, covering each other as they took down their attackers one by one. But the odds were against them. For every man they dropped, another seemed to take his place. Jake's rifle clicked empty and he switched to his sidearm, his movements growing slower as exhaustion set in. "We can't keep this up," Lauren said, her voice strained. Jake glanced at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We don't have to." Just as the mercenaries began to close in, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Spotlights lit up the clearing and a booming voice echoed through the woods. "Drop your weapons. This is the FBI." The mercenaries froze, their weapons lowering as the helicopters circled overhead. Moments later, a team of federal agents descended on the clearing, their movements swift and decisive. Jake and Lauren lowered their weapons, their bodies sagging with relief as the agents secured the scene. One of them, a woman in a dark suit, approached Jake. "Jake Carter?" she asked. He nodded, too tired to speak. "I'm Agent Harris," she said. "We've been tracking this operation for months. The intel you provided gave us what we needed to move in." Jake handed her the duffel bag, his hand shaking slightly. "This has everything you need to take down Kane and the broker." Harris took the bag, her expression serious. "We'll handle it from here." As dawn broke over the clearing, Jake and Lauren sat on the edge of a fallen log, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. The mercenaries had been taken into custody, and the evidence was on its way to federal headquarters. "You think this is really over?" Lauren asked, her voice quiet. Jake stared at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "Not yet. Kane's still out there, but this was a start." Lauren nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "You know, you're not as reckless as I thought." Jake chuckled softly. "Don't let that get out." As the two of them sat in the quiet woods, the weight of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, they had hope. And for Jake Carter, that was enough to keep going. Top of form. The federal convoy rolled out as the sun climbed higher, bathing the clearing in golden light. Jake watched as the last of the evidence-laden trucks disappeared down the dirt road, taking with them the culmination of everything he and Lauren had risked their lives to secure. For a brief moment, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter, but he knew better than to let his guard down completely. The fight wasn't truly over. Not yet. Lauren stepped up beside him, her arms crossed as she stared at the fading convoy. Feels strange, doesn't it? Letting someone else handle the next move. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. We've done what we could. Now it's up to them. She glanced at him, a small smirk tugging at her lips. You don't strike me as the hand it off and walk away type. I'm not, Jake admitted. But this is bigger than me. Bigger than us. The feds have the resources to take Kane and the broker down for good. We've given them everything they need. Lauren let out a quiet sigh, then turned to face him. So, what now? You disappear back into whatever hole you came from? Jake chuckled softly, the first genuine laugh he'd managed in days. Something like that. I'm not one for sticking around when the dust settles. They returned to the safe house, now a hollow shell of its former self. The bullet-riddled walls and shattered windows told the story of their battle, a story Jake would carry with him long after this chapter was closed. Lauren began gathering her gear, her movements deliberate but unhurried. Jake sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty coffee mug in front of him. The silence felt heavy, but not unwelcome. For the first time in weeks, there was no immediate threat looming over them, no enemy at the gates. It felt strange, almost unnatural. Do you ever stop? Lauren asked, breaking the silence. Jake looked up, confused. What do you mean? She gestured to him. Planning, thinking, moving. Even now, I can see your brain working. You're already trying to figure out what's next. Jake shrugged. It's how I'm wired. You don't survive this long by standing still. Lauren tilted her head, studying him. Maybe it's time to change that. Just for a little while. Jake leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. We'll see. The news broke a week later. Jake sat in a small diner on the outskirts of a sleepy town, a newspaper spread out in front of him. The headline was bold and impossible to miss. Major crime syndicate dismantled. Victor Kane and associates arrested in FBI raid. The article detailed the operation, praising federal agents for their work and noting the staggering scale of the criminal enterprise they'd uncovered. Jake's eyes scanned the page, searching for any mention of himself or Lauren. There was none. The article attributed the initial breakthrough to an anonymous tip, a phrase that brought a faint smile to his face. Mia had called earlier that morning to confirm the details. Kane had been arrested at his luxury penthouse, caught completely off guard by the raid. The evidence Jake and Lauren had recovered had been enough to secure warrants for his arrest and the seizure of his assets. The broker's network was crumbling, with other operatives being rounded up across multiple states. You did it, Jake, Mia had said. Kane's done. He'll never see the outside of a cell again. Jake had thanked her and hung up without saying much more. Victory wasn't something he celebrated. It was simply another step forward. As Jake folded the newspaper and slid it to the side, he glanced out the window. The world outside seemed unchanged, the same quiet streets and rolling hills he'd seen so many times before. But he knew better. Somewhere, people who'd been victims of Kane's operation were waking up to a new reality, one where they no longer had to live in fear. That was enough for him. Lauren slid into the booth across from him, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. You see the news? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Jake nodded. Kane's finished. She smiled faintly, taking a sip of her coffee. Feels good, doesn't it? It does, Jake admitted, his tone softer than usual. So, what now? She asked, leaning back in her seat. You going to ride off into the sunset? Jake smirked. Something like that. There's always another fight out there. someone else who needs help. Lauren's expression turned serious. You ever think about not fighting, about stopping, finding a place to just be? Jake didn't answer immediately. He stared at his coffee, his thoughts distant. I don't know if I'm built for that. Lauren nodded slowly. Maybe, but if you ever figure it out, let me know. They parted ways outside the diner, Lauren heading east while Jake drove west. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the open road as Jake's truck rumbled along. The radio played softly in the background, the familiar hum of static mixed with the faint strains of a country song. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of closure. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd made a difference, however small, in a world that often felt too big to change. But he also knew his work wasn't finished. There were still people like Kane out there, people who exploited the weak, thrived on fear, and believed they were untouchable. And as long as they existed, Jake Carter would keep moving, keep fighting, and keep proving them wrong. The horizon stretched out before him, vast and endless. Jake gripped the wheel, his jaw set with quiet determination. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. Because for Jake Carter, the road never truly ended. Did you enjoy this story? Hit the like button, subscribe for more thrilling content, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.